Masechet Baba Batra Daf Kof Lamed Enu Mishnah HaOmer Ish Peloni Irasheni B'makom sheyesh bat Biti Tirasheni B'makom sheyesh ben Lo Amar Kelum Shehitna Alma Shekatub Batorah. If someone on his deathbed said, I want so-and-so to inherit me, even though he has a daughter. In other words, this guy has no sons. So it's not going to go to his sons because he has none. It should go to his daughter because he has a daughter. That's the line of succession. But this guy doesn't want it to go to his daughter, so he names someone else who's not his daughter. Is that valid? Or if he says, I want my daughter to inherit me, even though he has a son. Now, that's not the right order. It should go to the son first, only to the son, and only then to the daughter. But he doesn't want to go in order. He wants to give it to his daughter instead of his son. So that statement is not valid at all. Even though someone on his deathbed, whatever he says, it's as if he wrote it. Because it has that power, but this is not valid because he's making a condition that's against the Torah. Of course, we saw before he can give it as a gift to anybody he wants, but here he's using the language of inheritance, so you have to go by the protocol of the Torah in inheritance law, and you can't make a condition against it. That's the opinion of Tanna Kama. Rabbi Yohanan ben Beroka Omer, Im Amar al mi she'ra'ui liyorsho, devarav kayamin, ve'al mi she'en ra'ui lo liyorsho, en devarav kayamin. Rabbi Yohanan ben Beroka, who we've quoted many times already, but here is the main source, the main Mishnah, where he states his opinion. He says, if the guy in his deathbed names someone who can inherit from him, then the words are valid. But if it's someone not related to him, just a friend, then it's not valid. So in other words, according to Yohanan ben Beroka, in these two cases, if he says, I want my daughter to inherit instead of my son, the second case here, that's valid because his daughter is in line of succession. Or in the first case, if he says a random person, no good. But if he says a different relative who could inherit him, I want that person to take everything rather than my daughter, then also that would be valid. So we have a fundamental machloket because Yochanan ben Beroka says, although it has to be in line of succession, so as long as it's there, the Torah said, listen, these are the people that can inherit a person. And it gives the order. So a person on his deathbed can change the order and say, I want to go to that person first. That's okay, because it's still a line of succession. What he cannot do is give it to someone else as an inheritance entirely, who's not even in the line of succession. Okay, that is the machloket. Now, the Gemara brings in a case that the Mishnah does not talk about explicitly. It says as follows, Tama de'acher b'makom bat ubat b'mkom ben. Ha ben habanim ubat ben habanot devarav kayamin. Notice that the Mishnah, Tanna Kama, only talked about a relatively large change. That's the change when you say take someone who is not in the first order, let's say there are sons, and he wants to skip over the sons altogether and give it to a daughter. Or instead of a daughter, he wants to give it to his brother. So this is making a big change, and that's where Tanna Kama said it's not valid. But what about making a small change, which I'm going to call these changes here that it says, let's say he has many sons, he has 3 sons, and he says, I want everything to go to 1 son. That's a small change because all 3 sons were going to inherit anyway. If there's a firstborn, they get double. If not, if there's no firstborn, so then they all get a third. So now he's making a small change because this son is going to get a third anyway. Now I want him to get more. I want the son to get F. I want the son to get everything. Or let's say there's no sons, there's only 3 daughters. And so each of the daughters would inherit equally. And he's making a small change to say, I want this particular daughter to get everything. So, since the Mishnah does not address the case of a small change, but only a big change, we can infer that only in the case of making a big change, like giving it to a daughter instead of a son, that's when it's no good. But since the Mishnah mentions that case, but not the smaller change, we can infer that if it's a small change, then it would be valid according to Tanna Kama. So is that a good reading? It seems like a logical inference. Here's the problem. Ema sefa. Rabbi Yohanan ben Beroka omer, im amar al mi she'ra'ui liyorsho devarav kayamin. Hainu Tanna Kama. So the continuation, according to Yohanan ben Beroka, he says that as long as it's someone in the line of succession, then the words are valid. But wouldn't that be the same as Tanna Kama? Because Tanna Kama, according to this inference, agrees that if you give everything to 1 son, that's in the line of succession, then that is valid, and Tanakama would agree with that. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka did not specify in what case it's valid, so maybe Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka is only talking about a case of a son among sons, and maybe he would agree with Tanakama that if it's a big change, then it would not be good. So we're not getting any explicit information about what is the controversy here. Now, now, if you say, which is what we probably assumed when we read the Mishnah, that according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, even a different person, a brother, he wants to give it to instead of the daughter, or he wants to give it to a daughter, even though there is a son, meaning that Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says a big change is permitted. Right? So this would be a perfectly good reading of the Mishnah, that according to Tanakama, a large change is no good, a small change is okay. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka is even more lenient and say not only a small change, even a big change, as long as it's anywhere in the line of succession, would be okay. So this is certainly fits in with the words of the Mishnah, and in fact, we're going to come back to that very interpretation. The problem is that we have a baraita that goes against it. V'hatanya, Rabbi Shmuel beno shel Rabbi Yohanan ben Beroka omer. We have a baraita by Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yohanan ben Beroka. Presume he should know what his father meant when he and what he taught. And he explains, Lo nechleku Abba v'chachamim al acher b'makom bat ubat b'makom ben shelo amar kelum. He says, my father and the chachamim did not disagree regarding a big change. They agree that if he makes a big change, like giving it to a daughter when there is a son, then it's invalid. So they both agree on that. In that case, amar nechleku. So what is the point of disagreement? Al ben habanim ubat ben habanot shaba omed yirash chachamim omerim lo yirash. They argue regarding a small change, giving it to one son when there are many sons, or one daughter when there are many daughters. And my father said, that's valid. Small change is valid. Chachamim say even a small change is not valid. So you see that everybody agrees that a small change is not valid, and that goes against this inference that we just made. So now, how are we going to explain this Mishnah? We have two answers. Perhaps we only have part of this baraita, because the baraita starts off saying lo nechleku. Sounds like Rabbi Shmuel is disagreeing with a Tanakama. So even though Rabbi Shmuel is a son, okay, son doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, and there was another interpretation. And according to Tanakama of that baraita, he thinks that they, in fact, disagreed regarding a large change. And so that's the way we wanted to read it to begin with. That according to Tanakama, a large change is not allowed, but a small change, brother among brothers, that's valid, according to Tanakama. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says even a large change is permitted. So the point of argument is regarding the large change of giving it to, for example, a daughter when there is a son. That's the first answer. Or we could say this entire Mishnah is in fact the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. And this Tanakama's opinion is not even recorded in this Mishnah. Ha'omer, ish peloni ira במקום שיש בת, ביתי תירשני במקום שיש בן, לא אמר כלום. In this reading, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka is actually more stringent. Right? In the first reading, he's very lenient and permits even a big change. In this reading, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka himself says, if it's a big change, like give it to my brother instead of my daughter, or give it to my daughter instead of my son, then that's not valid. But we can infer from these words, Habat ben habanot uben ben habanim, im amar yirash kol nechasav devarav kayamin. But if he wants to make a small change, give it to one son among sons, or one daughter among daughters, then that would be valid. She Rabbi Yochanan omer, im amar al mi shera'oi liyorsho devarav kayamin. That in fact is valid, for Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka said that as long as it's someone that is fit to inherit, and by now, in this reading, that means not fit to inherit anywhere down the line, but fit to inherit directly. He is a son. He's going to inherit right now anyway. In that case, he can give more to one son. He can give everything to one son, and that would be valid because that son is going to inherit anyway. And in this reading, Tanakama is Rabbi Yohanan Beroka. It just quotes it anonymously and then explains, oh, this is the opinion because Rabbi Yohanan Beroka, that's who was speaking this whole time. And he says that a small change is permitted. So that's the difference between the first answer is, according to that, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka is more lenient and allows even a big change. According to the second version, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka is more stringent, only allows a small change, but not a big change. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel Halacha ki Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka v'chen Amar Rava Halacha ki Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. And both Shemuel and Rava say Halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. So you can see why the Gemara just now did everything that it just did. It went through these gymnastics and said, well, you make an inference against the Braita, what are you going to do about that? And then said, kind of really reread the Mishnah. The Mishnah in the Peshat reading has a Tanakama and a Yochanan ben Beroka. However, if that's true, there's a majority and a minority, we should follow halacha like the majority. But since you see the sages later on said halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, so this opening sugya here goes ahead and explains that actually there is no Tanakama. Tanakama is Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, so therefore he represents the only opinion in the Mishnah, and that justifies that the halacha would follow his opinion. Amar Rava, my tamed Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. What is the source for his opinion that even someone down the line, a son among sons, is allowed to inherit, however you interpret him? What's the source? Amar Kira, vaya biyom hanchilo et banav, haTorah natena reshut la'av lanchil lechol mi sheyirseh. Rava explains that we learn it from this pasuk over here. It says vaya biyom hanchilo et banav et asher yelo lo yuchal levaker. So we're going to analyze two phrases. The first one, when a father makes his sons inherit, that's one phrase. And the other phrase here is he cannot give preference over the son that's not actually the firstborn. He cannot deprive the real firstborn, even if it's from the wife who is not loved. So let's see why we need both of these phrases. And so Rabbi explains, since it says that on the day that he bequeaths to his sons, you see from this phrase that the Torah gives permission to a father to bequeath to anyone he wants, to any son he wants, right? When he bequeaths to his sons. So that means he is doing it. He has agency. It's not like it's an automatic formula that when he dies it goes automatically. It's true, if he dies and doesn't say anything, then yes. But if he says something and specifies, right, when he bequeaths to his sons, he can say, I want to give this son more and less to the other son. So that's how we know that Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka is valid. That's a source. Amar Abaye, ha mi lo yuchal levaker nafka. Abaye says, no, I can learn that already from a different pasuk, from the continuation of the pasuk, where it says that a father is not allowed to deprive a firstborn. I can infer from that. A father is not allowed to deprive the real firstborn of a double portion. That's specifically where the prohibition lies. But it's permitted to do other changes, like to give nothing to the second child and give everything to the third child. Then that would be fine. As long as he takes care of the firstborn, that's the only prohibition. So I can learn from that phrase. Why do I need Vaya b'yom hanchilot banav? Abaye says I can learn it from lo yuchal levaker. And the answer is, I in fact need lo yuchal levaker for a different reason. And now we're going to quote a long baraita. Abba Hanan amar mishum Rabbi Eliezer. In this baraita, Abba Hanan, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, will explain why I actually need both of these phrases. Ma tamud omar lo yuchal levaker. What does this phrase come to teach us? That you cannot benefit one firstborn from the beloved wife over the real firstborn. You cannot deprive the real firstborn. What do we learn from this? Because the opening phrase says when you give to your sons, which sounds like you can give it to anybody, and that we do. We learn from that. He can redistribute among sons. I could have have learned a kavachomer as follows. If a regular son who is stronger, in what way is a regular son stronger in his power to inherit? In that he inherits not only what the father has in his current property when he dies, but even potential money. If someone dies and he inherits after, or someone pays him something after, then the regular son inherits that too. So you see that a regular son is more powerful. Yet the Torah gave power to the father to say, no, son number 2, I don't want you to get anything. Everything that you were going to get, I'm giving to son number 3. So even though regular sons are so powerful, yet the father is even more powerful and can move things around. So a firstborn who has less power to inherit in that, although he's getting more money, but he only inherits that which the father has in his hand when he dies, and not new money that comes into the estate afterwards. So, the Bechor, who's less powerful, all the more so the father should have the power to redistribute that which is coming to him. That's what I would have thought if I only had the Pasuk, Vaya b'yom chilo et banav. Therefore, Talmud Lomad lo yuchal lebaker. That's why I need a special Pasuk to teach me, hey, for the firstborn, there's a special prohibition. You cannot show favor to a different son. You have to give it to the firstborn, because otherwise I would have learned from the Kavachomer that I could change from the firstborn. That's why I need that pasuk. Now Yochanan continues. So why not just have the prohibition at the end of at the second part of the pasuk that he cannot give favor to one over the firstborn? So just have that. Why do I need the beginning of the pasuk that says that he can distribute to any of the children? Sheyachol v'halo dinhu ma bechol she'ura kocho she'eno notel b'ra'oi k'ma muchzak amra Torah lo yuchal levaker, because I could have learned the kavachomer the other way around. If a firstborn who has weakness in that the firstborn only gets that which the father has in his hand when he dies, and not new money that comes into the estate. And yet, even though he's weak in that way, the Torah says, Father, you cannot take away that firstborn. Pashut sheyipakocho, a regular son who has a higher power to inherit, because a regular son can take that which comes into the estate later on, right? Potential money that comes in. Lo kol sheken, all the more so that the father should not be able to redistribute from son number 2 to son number 3. In other words, again, if the firstborn who has relatively weak power to inherit, and yet the father cannot make any changes to what the firstborn gets, then a regular son who has even more power, all the more so, a father will not be able to make changes. So if I only had the second phrase, then I would think a father cannot make any changes to any of the sons. Talmud Omar vaya biyom hanchilo et banav haTorah natena reshut av lanchil lechol mi sheyirseh. That's why I need the first phrase also to teach me a permission against that kavachomer, that regarding the other sons, the Torah gives him permission to take away from the second, give it to the third, or vice versa, or redistribute. As long as the firstborn gets his double portion, everybody else, the father can redistribute. Amar Rabbi Zerika, Amar Rabbi Ameh, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Amar Rabbi. All these, Rabbi said the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Halacha, Rabbi Yohanan ben Beroka, halacha does follow Rabbi Beroka as we saw above. Amar Rabbi Abba, Hora Itmar. However, Rabbi Abba says, no. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did not say the halacha follows him, but rather he himself made rulings in accordance with Rabbi Yohanan ben Beroka. So now we're going to analyze what's the difference between whether someone said explicitly halacha is like this rabbi, or if he actually did it himself. Which one is stronger? B'may kami palge mor sabar halacha adifa or mor sabar maaseh adifa. So the different formulas depends on if you think that halacha, saying an outright law, is better. That's a more authoritative statement. So the first statement by Rabbi Zerika, they thought that saying of a general ruling, a general statement, halacha is like Rabbi Yohanan Beroka, that's a stronger statement than knowing that the person actually did it, because here the rabbi is saying, and explicitly, everybody can follow this halacha. So isn't that better? If he happened to follow the ruling in one case, who knows? Maybe he was making an exception. Maybe there was some detail about that case, and that's why he said it. We don't know if for sure he would apply that to other cases. But if you say a general ruling, then surely that's very authoritative. That's the most. However, Moar Savad, Rabbi Abba thought that actually doing it is preferable, because sometimes someone says halacha is this. What he means is that it makes sense that halacha should be that way. This argument, this source is very good. Halacha is like that. Would you actually do it yourself? That's the real test. And so if you see a rabbi actually did this himself, then you know it's good. All right, maybe a rabbi will say, this is kosher. Would they eat it themselves? Maybe when it actually comes to him, he say, you know what, I'm not kind of in doubt. I'm not going to eat it myself. Even though he said a statement, he's saying that it makes sense. But until you see the rabbi actually do it, so that's more powerful. Doesn't matter if he said it was kosher or not. I saw him eat this item, and so therefore, right, isn't that a better proof? So that's the machloket between these two sages and the way they formulate it. But they both agree that the halacha does follow Rabbi Yohanan ben Beroka. Teno Rabbanan, en lemedin halacha lo mepi Talmud velo mepi maaseh ad sheyomeru lo halacha lemaaseh. And now a discussion about how you decide if something is authoritative or not, whether you can actually follow it. And this Braita says we do not learn a halacha not from Talmud and not from an actual case. Talmud is not talking about the Gemara, because this is a Braita. Talmud means from an apodictic statement, right? A general statement that says halacha is like this. Even if you heard that a certain rabbi said halacha is like this, doesn't mean that you can do it. And also, if you heard that, if you saw a rabbi rule in such a way, also you cannot follow it, because maybe there's some exception to that case. Who knows? Until the rabbi says this is a halacha lema'aseh. He says this is a practical halacha. If he just says this is a halacha, then you're just like, it means that it makes sense. But if he says halacha lema'aseh, this is halacha, and you can follow it, until the rabbi says specifically that, you cannot assume that it's authoritative. Sha'al v'amru lo halacha l'maaseh, yelech v'yaseh maaseh, bilbad shelo yedameh. If you ask the sages and they say, yes, that is halacha l'maaseh, it's a practical halacha you can follow, then you can go ahead and you can follow that ruling in a case that's exactly the same. But don't now go make comparisons and say, well, they said it's permitted in this case. My case is a little different, but it seems like it's very similar, so I'll apply the ruling also to a similar case. No, don't do that, because you never know what is the key factor that made something permitted in one case, and maybe that factor would not apply in a similar case. And so don't compare one case to another. Now we ask, what do you mean you can't compare cases? The whole Torah, that's all we do. We compare cases. Obviously, the Torah cannot give examples of every single detail of every case that will ever come up. Certainly not Torah shebichtav, even Torah sheba'al peh. As big as the whole Talmud is, it's not going to cover every detail of every case. The whole point of a judge is that he's going to have to say, well, here's the cases that I know that the Torah talks about, and I have to see, does this fit into this category or that? Is it more similar to this or more similar to that? Everything that we do is comparing cases. That's the whole point of our learning. Rav Ashi says, no, yes, in other areas, of course, yes, you can compare one thing to another. If you want to know if something is permitted on Shabbat or prohibited on Shabbat. So then, of course, yes, you compare cases. Is it this? Is sifting similar to grinding? Is it this like that? Yes, then you're going to compare one thing to another. Is electricity like fire? It is in a way like fire, in a way it's not like fire. Okay, of course, you have to make comparisons. What they meant when they said don't make comparisons, that specifically was talking about terefot. When you do shechita on an animal, and then you check its insides to see if it was healthy. If you see that it had a disease like a punctured lung and it would have died within 12 months, then it's not kosher. So terefot are very complicated because you have to know there's a certain injury that this animal had. Would that injury have led to it to die within 12 months or not? So in this case, you cannot compare one thing to another because you might see the same thing over here and that would be deadly, but if it's a couple of inches over on a different organ, then it could be not deadly. So just because, I remember I saw an animal that was similar to this and the rabbi permitted it, doesn't mean that in the next case when it's not exactly the same, it would be permitted. The Tanya, en omrim betrefot zo doma lezo, ve'al titmaha, shareh chotcha mikan umeta, chotcha mikan vechayeta. And the Braita supports this. It says, we do not, in the laws of terefot, say, this wound is similar to that wound. And don't wonder about this, that you can't learn similar things. Why not? Because I could say, well, look, I remember there was a wound that was 1 inch big and the rabbi permitted it. Yeah, but a lot of times you take an animal, if you cut it from on this side, it will die. If you cut it on the other side, it will live. Many people get gunshot wounds. Some die, some live. Is a gunshot wound a gunshot wound? No, it depends. Is it hit an artery? Does it hit a major organ? And so it makes a big difference precisely where it is, precisely how it is, what side it's on, and therefore don't make comparisons regarding terefot. Amar le Rabbi aseh le Rabbi Yohanan ki amar lan mod halacha hachi nabed maaseh. So Rabbi aseh asked Rabbi Yohanan, his teacher, says, Master, when you tell us halacha is like this, should we follow it? Does that mean we can follow it lema'aseh? Amar la ta'abidu adamina halacha lema'aseh. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Only follow it if I say halacha lema'aseh. That's a practical halacha. If I just say halacha, then that doesn't mean that you can actually do it. It just means that there's an argument for this side, but it doesn't mean you can put it into practice. Amar lehu Rav Rav Papa ul Rav Huna bere de Rav Yoshua ki ate pesaka dedina didi lekamaychu vechazitu bepircha la tikreuhu ad deatitu lekamay. Rava told Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yoshua, these were Rava's students. He said, if I make a ruling about something and then it comes to you and you see a problem with it, don't rip it up. In other words, if I said something and then it's disputed and I'm not around and then someone comes to you, you're going to an appeals court, don't just rip it up and say, it didn't make sense what Rava said, but rather come to me and ask me about it. And if I have a reason, I might have a reason that you didn't think of, right? And just don't assume that I made a mistake. And here's the deal: if I come and I have an explanation, I'll tell it to you, and then you'll see that you'll agree. And if I don't have an explanation, maybe I made a mistake, I'll be the first to change my mind. So ask me first. Don't assume that Rabbi, he must have made a mistake. Sometimes I might have a subtle point of reasoning, and I base my logic on that. I don't necessarily publish and tell everybody why I said that. So ask me first, and then either I'll explain it to you or I'll be the first to change my mind. Rava continues and tells his students, after I die, if you hear about something that I did and it seems questionable, then do not tear it up, because maybe I had a reason. I'm not around anymore to ask after I die, but don't tear it up because maybe I had a reason. But also don't learn from it, because you have to follow your own judgment. And if you think that this didn't make sense, then don't copy my ruling. So don't tear it up. Leave if it was there already, grandfathered in, leave my rulings in place, even though don't necessarily replicate it if it doesn't make sense to you. Don't rip it up, because if I were alive, I might have given you an explanation. So don't assume I didn't have an explanation. But don't learn from it either if you don't agree with it, because every judge has to follow what his own eyes see. Rabbi. You can't just say, well, someone else thought this, so, well, they must have known. No, every judge has to use his own eyes, his own judgment of whatever is there before him. And if you see that this doesn't make sense, so you follow your own judgment. Every judge has to be honest with himself. Of course, he has to learn from his rabbis and follow the traditions. But if there's something that doesn't make sense to him, then don't follow it. Follow whatever you think is right, but have enough respect that don't tear up what I said before. Give me the benefit of the doubt that I did have a reason, which is a beautiful compromise between following tradition, but also we're using our own understanding to make sure that we are completely honest with the past and with the present. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.